Well, morning everyone, and thanks for coming along. As Jane mentioned to us, this is the first time we've ever done a final settlement webinar. There usually hasn't been enough to talk about between the provisional and the final, so we don't normally do a final settlement webinar, but there's actually a huge amount this year, both in terms of the additional money, the additional £600 million that was announced at the end of last month, but also it's just a much more complicated settlement than we normally have with the decoupling of the multiplier. It's just created a whole set of other issues as well. So there's actually an awful lot to talk about that's new between the provisional and the final settlements. So I'll start off with my analysis of the settlement, what's in there, what's changed, and how some of those elements of it work. And then Dan will come in and do an analysis of the distribution and some insight into what's happening in the settlement and how the money is moving around the country. Just a quick set of links to where you can find details on the settlement. I'm sure you've already seen that, but it's worth looking at the written statement from Michael Gove alongside the final settlement documents as well. The public health grant allocations are available. I think there's a written statement there from the Minister about what the grant allocations are, and I think there's a new link that's available for the local authority circular on social care grants, so it's worth looking at that too. So the headlines are that there's an additional £600 million funding package that was announced on the 24th of January. That was, I think, only 2 days after the letter came out from 40 odd Conservative MPs saying they wouldn't be voting for the final settlement. So that was a pretty quick response between that letter hitting the presses and the new money being announced. And broadly, it was 500 million for social care. So that's the big headline increase in funding. And then a further 100 million split between the Rural Services Delivery Grant, 15 million, the islands, the Isle of Wight, the Isles of Scilly, about 3.15 million additional, and then an increase in the funding guarantee from 3% to 4%, and the remainder going into the services grant. The public health grant allocations for 24-25 were announced on the same day as the final settlement numbers came out. That's actually a bit earlier than normal. Often they don't come out until well into March or even in April sometimes. So good to get that confirmation earlier than later. So that increase in funding of 600 million takes us from an increase in core spending power of 6.5% in the provisional to 7.5% in the final settlement. And I think it is fair to say it's an unprecedented increase in funding between the provisional and final. Looking back over recent years, the only big increase in funding that I could remember was in the 2016-17 settlement, where the transition grant was brought in. That was £300 million over 2 years, £150 million in each year, and that wasn't baseline. So that was a one-off pot of money. And I think talking to Stuart Hoggan as well, he was saying I think that is probably the biggest he could remember as well. So that's, it is. I think it's fair to say it was an unprecedented large increase in funding between the provisional and the final. Then we had the expected announcement of the £100 million on the levy account, the surplus on the levy account, same as we had for 22-23, announced at the same time last year. And then this new grant for green plant and machinery exemptions on business rates, which we kind of knew about, but we didn't really expect to see that. And I'd almost forgotten about it, to be honest. I'd seen some information around it back in the summer, but the amounts at that time were a lot smaller, only a tenth of the amount. So I didn't think it was amounting to much at all. We'll look at that in a second. And then finally, this new burden on you all, productivity plans. I don't know whether that's just something and nothing, just a catch to go alongside the additional increase in funding. I noticed when we were having our funding cut, we weren't asked to do productivity plans or to say how it affects us. We were just given the cut. When there's new money, there's always a catch attached to it. So core spending power increases, as we said, 7.5% cash terms growth in core spending power in 24-25, plus that additional 1% that came out in the final settlement. Now, above inflation increased in core spending power since 2021. And in cash terms, these are the largest settlements that we've had for a long time, since at least I think 2008, 2009, before the financial crash. So in cash terms, and I emphasize the cash terms, but the best settlements we've had certainly since before the austerity period. Now, I know Jeff will always pick me up on this to make sure that real terms can be defined in different ways. One measure obviously is to compare that to consumer price index, and on that basis, if CPI is down at 4% now and probably in 24-25 down at around 3.6%, that's a pretty substantial real terms increase on that basis. An even bigger increase if you compare it to the GDP deflator. But of course, the problem is that in our services, the increases in planned spending in adult social care is 12.8%, in children's services 13.6%, homelessness as well going up very quickly. So the actual costs that you're budgeting for are going up much more quickly than 7.5% next year. So measuring whether something is a real terms increase or not is really quite difficult. These are great settlements in cash terms, but in terms of whether that delivers you enough to balance your budget, you know that it's falling short. So here's the summary of the numbers within the core spending power settlement. You've got that increase that was just over 600 million. The numbers we talked about already, the 500 million pound for social care grant. It cost 72 million for the increase in the funding guarantee from 3% to 4%. That left 11 million pounds for the services grant. There was a small adjustment to the new homes bonus, as people I think it was Watford, just confirmed their new homes bonus numbers, and then rural services delivery grant up by 15 million. You'll see as well that council tax went up by 9 million. I think that was just those authorities with the additional thresholds on Band D, Slough, Thurrock and Woking getting their 10% increase in their Band D. That generated an additional 9 million. And then there's 3 million pounds that goes to the internal drainage board levies to fund those authorities, which obviously is outside core spending power. So they're the changes between provisional and final. No changes in terms of what's happening with SFA and cap compensation. Those two elements together broadly increase in line with the consumer price index, 6.62%. Then you've got council tax increasing by 2 billion. When we looked at the provisional figures, the increase in council tax was just over half the increase in core spending power. It's now quite a bit under half, but still increasing by 6%. And if you want the full increase in core spending power, you still need to increase your Band D by the maximum available to you. Then a whole range of increases in social care grants. We'll look at those in a bit more detail later, but not as big as in 23-24, but still pretty chunky increases in social care funding. We still have a reduction in services grant, albeit not as big as we had in the provisional, down by just under 400 million. So a big reduction there in services grant. In some respects, the services grant is just the balancing figure. Whatever is available in the settlement goes into other pots, and whatever's left ends up in services grant. So looking at the distribution, this is the 23-24 settlement, and you can see here very clearly the authorities on the left. These are social care authorities broadly, boroughs, London boroughs, Mets, unitaries, shire counties, bigger increases than those authorities on the right, which are shire districts or fire authorities. And clearly, the authorities on the left have got bigger increases because they've got social care responsibilities. They get the social care funding, which is increasing more quickly than other elements of core spending power, and also largely have high access to higher increases in Band D as well. 24-25 increase in core spending power. These are the provisional figures, and you can see here that those on the left, the social care authorities are still getting higher increases in core spending power, but the differential between social care authorities and other types of authority is a lot smaller in 24-25 than it was in the current year. Then if we look at the additional core spending power that was announced in the final settlement, you can see that big block at the bottom is basically the previous slide. They're the increase in core spending power on a percentage basis for the provisional settlement. So the authorities on the left having the higher increases because they're social care authorities, those on the left, fire authorities and districts having smaller increases. And then you can see the blocks above that, that's where the additional money's gone to. So additional social care funding, the 500 million, has gone to obviously to the social care authorities, and that's worth just roughly about 1% of core spending power for those authorities. Then on the right hand side, you've got the 4% funding guarantee. That increase from 3% to 4%, that's broadly gone and funded shire districts and fire authorities. You'll see within that sort of that area on the right, you'll see that there are some sort of greyish bars. They're rural services delivery grants. That's where you can see that £15 million has gone to shire districts. It's given them more rural services delivery grant, and that's largely been just soaked up by a reduction in their 4% funding guarantee. So most of that rural service delivery grant for shire districts in particular has not gone to increase their core spending power. It's just reduced their 4% funding guarantee. And then right in the middle there, you see those two yellow bars sticking up. That's a 3.15 million that goes through to the Isle of Wight on the left and the Isles of Scilly on the right. In terms of core spending power, it's a similar sort of increase for both those two authorities, about 2% broadly, a bit more for the Scillies than for the Isle of Wight. But you can see there, that's in terms of an increase in core spending power, they're big increases relative to what their allocations would be otherwise. But what that additional funding has done is roughly, it's given every type of authority, every class of authority, a similar increase in core spending power. So the £600 million has kind of been spread right around the country and given every class of authority an increase of just short of 1% core spending power, a bit higher in some authorities, unitaries and shire counties, a bit lower in others, particularly inner London and outer London boroughs. And the GLA also gets its 0.8% increase in core spending power. I'm not sure if Martin's on the call today, but that as we'll see later, that's come entirely from 24 or largely from £24 million in the funding guarantee, which I didn't fully expect, to be honest. I can see Martin's just said that he's there. So yeah, that was a big increase for the Greater London Authority. I'll skate over this a little bit because I know Dan's going to look a lot more at distribution, but one thing the IFS was saying at the provisional settlement was that it wasn't particularly progressive in terms of the way that funding was distributed. The most deprived authorities were getting similar increases in core spending power to the least deprived. I think that might have shifted a little bit, but not by much. The distribution in terms of deprivation is quite flat, and flatter in 24-25 than it was last year in 23-24. Not much movement on the thresholds. The only changes are that the maximum increases for those authorities in financial difficulties been confirmed now at 10% for the three of them, for Slough, Thurrock and Woking, all getting access to the 10% increase in Band D. Nothing changing for fire authorities. I know fire authorities really wanting that £5 threshold that they had in 23-24 now removed, and no change on that. Shire districts as well, really wanting their threshold to increase from £5 to £10, but again, no movement on that. Just sort of reflecting on some of these things around the decoupling of the multiplier and the impact that's had on the indexing the baseline funding level and also on cap compensation. Now, I spent a bit of time looking at this and trying to work out whether the uplift in our baseline funding level and cap compensation taken together it does match the 6.62% consumer price index increase that we were assured that it would. And you see on the right there that if we look at different types of authority, the increase when you take those elements together, i.e. SFA, including baseline funding level and RSG and cap compensation, doesn't quite go up by the 6.62%. There's a mix there of about 6.5%, 6.4%, so slightly under it. Now, I know colleagues at LG Futures have done quite a lot of work at this, and they think that the formula is not correct and it does undercompensate authorities. I must admit, I'm not fully I'm not sure about that myself. And I think looking at the numbers, I think that we're probably okay in that we were overcompensated on the standard multiplier in 23, 24 and in previous years. And by shifting to a proper decoupled multiplier and a proper decoupled cap compensation system, I think we are properly compensated. But I would be interested to see how LG Futures can take that forward with the department. I know they've not had a response yet from officials there to confirm one way or the other whether it's been done correctly. So reserve a little bit of judgment. I think if it is off, it's very marginally so, but we do want it to be correct, obviously. But that does leave us with a slight gap in the way that cap compensation is applied. Now that you've been through the NNDR1s and you've completed them and handed them back, you'll know how they work and you'll know how the cap compensation is calculated for non-domestic rating income and for the Section 31 grants for reliefs. That's fairly straightforward. You've got a cap compensation fraction for each type of income from each multiplier, and the NNDR1 splits the income between the two multipliers. The bit that's harder and the bit that I've had quite a few questions about is about how do you then calculate the cap compensation in respect of your top up or tariff, because that isn't covered in the NNDR1. It's not covered in the settlement either. The way we've done it in the model is to calculate a weighted average cap compensation fraction and then applied that to the top up or tariff. So you see there on the right, this is the example for Buckinghamshire Fire Authority, Buckinghamshire Fire and Rescue. So you can see there in the top sort of table, that's an excerpt from the indexation and multiplier tab. You can see there that we've kind of inferred from the numbers in the settlement that Buckinghamshire Fires get 75% of their income from the standard multiplier and the remainder from the small multiplier. So we can then weight their cap compensation fraction accordingly. So for 24-25, that would be 18.7%. We've then applied that weighted cap compensation fraction to their top up to give them in 24-25 a cap compensation amount in respect to their top up of 298,000. Now there's no specific guidance on that or how that works or numbers to kind of follow and check. So that's our interpretation of how that would work. And we're also using numbers in terms of that split between the standard and small multipliers that's provided by DLUC within the revaluation spreadsheet. And that's again relying on data from the VOA. So we're taking quite a lot of that on trust really about how that works, where the data comes from, where that data is accurate and sort of realistic. And that's how we think that cap compensation amount would be calculated in respect of top up or tariff. New homes bonus, no change really no change in methodology from the provisional settlement. There was a small change in the actual amounts with NHB going down by, I think about 700,000 or 800,000. I think that's entirely because Watford's new homes bonus amount changed by by about 600,000, and that had a knock-on effect to Hertfordshire's as well. I think Dan might pick that up. I think it was probably an error, I'd imagine. So Watford had by far the highest increase in core spending power in the provisional. And that was caused by, I think, an erroneous NHB allocation. Now, of course, looking forward, the issue is this really the final year for new homes bonus? And I think we've had a conversation about this before, and our view now is that I think we will model the NHB being around again for one more year in 25-26. I think as Stuart's mentioned, a newly arrived government really won't have a chance to get rid of new homes bonus in time for the provisional settlement in December this year. So the chances are that will continue for one more year. Services grant, a bit of a roller coaster over the last few years, falling from 822 million in 22 to 23 down to 483 million this year, then down to 77 million in the provisional and back up to 87 million in the final this year. It's kind of just a balancing figure in the settlement, but confusingly, it has had these two uplifts for the islands, £3 million extra for the Isle of Wight and another £150,000 for the Isles of Scilly. The base distribution uses the 13-14 settlement funding assessment, but there are some odd things in the way that it does incorporate those additional amounts of funding for the Isle of Wight and the Isles of Scilly. I've managed to get the numbers to work, but it's a slightly odd way that it seems to have been done. Social care grant, that additional £500 million that we've mentioned a few times that was announced on the 24th of January, there were no changes in the way that the social care grants calculated. There were no changes in the council tax equalisation element. It remained at £160 million. So that's out of the total potential precept increase of 532. So most of the precept not equalised, but no change in the way that that's done within the formula. Yeah, we've worked that through in our model. There are some, and if you want to see the calculations, they're in the social care grant precept adjustment tab. There were some small variations, but I think they're just caused by us having slightly different assumptions for tax base in our model compared to those that are in the settlement itself. But the numbers that are in the main tab, the MTFP tab in our model, are the actual final numbers, not our calculations. So the 4% funding guarantee, this took a lot more work than I wanted it to do. We'd spent an awful long time over the last week trying to work out what these numbers were going to be and trying to recalculate what's going on. Really not helped at all by DLUHC not providing any proper guidance on how the numbers are calculated and no calculations to see how they've done it. So it took a bit of detective work, and thanks to Nick Morgan at North Yorkshire for giving us a hand, and also for colleagues at Society of County Treasurers. Spent quite a lot of time working this through, and I think in the end we have got there. So an increase in the funding for the funding guarantee, up from 196 million to 269 million. So quite a bit of an uplift there. As I said, it's a difficult calculation, and the description of it was fairly vague from DLUHC, but I think broadly the way it works is that you create a baseline for 23-24 that excludes any rolled in grants. So excludes the fire pension grant and excludes the workforce grant that was rolled in as well. So essentially, you just remove those from the funding guarantee baseline for 23-24. You then work out how much additional revenues you would get from tax base growth. Now, again, the tax base change is not provided anywhere in the settlement. So doing a bit of digging around, it's the 4-year average. So it's that change up to 2023-24. And that's the formula that I've used to calculate the cumulative percentage increase in tax base that I think that they've used in the settlement. And it does seem to work out. If you look at the chart there, you can see, so the table there on the right, you can see for Ada, district council's fairly simple calculation because there were no rolled in grants. So you can see there that the minimum funding guarantee uplift is 388,000 for them. Tax base change 0.86%. So then you can work out what their change in tax yield should be, an extra 61,000. Then the increases in all the grants within the core spending power, except the workforce grant and removing the change in the fire pension grant within SFA. So that we're getting the tax base change correct. Wokingham, slightly different. They're social care authority with no fire responsibility. So you can see there in the baseline, we remove the workforce fund to calculate the correct baseline, and then add in the change, the tax yield, and add in the increases in the grants within core spending power. That again seems to be spot on. Some slight movement there for Nottinghamshire Fire Authority, similar, exactly the same approach, but this time removing the fire pension grant from the baseline and also removing it from the SFA as well. So pretty close there in terms of matching what's in the final settlement. And then for Surrey and Greater London Authority, same process, removing the amounts from the baseline and then adding in the change in the tax base and the change in other parts of the core spending power. Fairly close, but not spot on. We've still got a variance of 32,000 on Surrey and 140,000 on the Greater London Authority. I suspect that's just something to do with tax-based changes rather than anything else, but I think that proves the concept of how those figures are calculated. Rural Services Delivery Grant, I think Dan covers a bit more. £15 million extra government change claiming it's the largest cash increase in RSDG since 1819, second successive year of above inflation increases. 1/3 of it, I think, is offset by the increase in the funding guarantees. That's pretty much every Shire District Council apart from Melton. So the real increase in spending power from the RSDG, I think, is only about 10.6 million. So obviously the bigger cash numbers go into upper tier authorities who don't tend to get captured by the funding guarantee. I think the North Yorkshire is the only one that's slightly anomalous there. RSDG taking it above the funding guarantee, so losing. So I guess part of that increase from RSDG was lost in reduced funding guarantee payments. Verdicts on that, I think it's better for rural authorities to have more resource in RSDG, even if most of it is offset, or a large chunk of it is offset by the funding guarantee movements. I think what this says is that the funding guarantee is not particularly well designed. It's not a great feature of the settlement. You know, it can have some quite perverse results. Public health grant, it's a really odd one. I'm not quite sure what they've done here. I can't follow how they've changed the allocations. I can't follow what they've rolled into the grant. The descriptions are very poor. The numbers aren't very well worked through. I had quite a few comments and questions about that. I can't get to the bottom of it. So I think I'm not sure if colleagues have written already. I'll certainly try and write to the public health team and try and get some more information about how they've done those numbers. I also can't substantiate their claim that there's been a 4% real terms increase in funding over the last 2 years. That's what the spending review promised us, and obviously that's what they're trying to prove, but I can't see that from the figure. So I'd like to know from the public health team what's going on and what those numbers actually mean and how they've calculated them. That's the email there. If you want to give it a try, put a bit of pressure on them to be a bit more open, that would be great. And if you get anything, let me know. Levy account surplus, another £100 million distribution from the levy account in respect of 23-24. So that's the same as 22-23, and the basis of distribution they're telling us will be the same as well. So I haven't seen the allocations specifically announced yet anywhere. So I would assume it's the same payment for 23-24 as it was for 22-23. There's still quite a lot of money in that levy account. Even after last year's £100 million surplus distribution, there's still a remaining surplus of 220 million. So there's plenty in there to distribute, and I would expect something similar over at least the next 2 or 3 years. Then this green plant and machinery thing. In essence, it's an exemption that was introduced in 22-23, and it reduces the rateable values, I think, following any qualifying investment. So you won't even see the deduction in your numbers. It reduces the rateable values before you actually get them. So it's not like a relief where you would see the rateable value and then make a deduction from a relief. You wouldn't even see these numbers coming through your NMDR1s and NMDR3s. This is an excerpt from some of the slides that we saw from DLUC at the back end of the summer. They thought the cost of this was only about 2.3 million, which is why I didn't really think much about it. But obviously they're thinking now it's more like 27 million, which is not huge, but it's worth having the money. And they were thinking at that time much simpler to give you a grant rather than to make adjustments going through the whole system. So that's what they've done. Kind of sprang it on us in terms of what the numbers are, but there we are. And I think those levels of allocation will continue until there is a baseline reset. So whatever you're getting in 24-25, I think you can budget on getting as well in at least 25-26 and maybe longer, depending on when the baseline reset happens. Internal Drainage Board levies, another £3 million. They aren't going to tell you how much everyone's got until they've seen what the levies are actually looking like from the CTR1. So I think they'll announce the distribution when that's done. And I think they're looking for a longer term solution. Obviously £3 million is a good deal less than the actual levies that you're dealing with. So still quite some big shortfalls for many authorities. Business rate pilots, no issues as far as we can see. I think the only issue was around the baselines and the top-ups and tariffs for Greater Manchester. They don't appear to reflect the public health grant allocations that were announced on the day of the final settlement, but it's not unusual for those baselines to be adjusted after the final anyway, just because the public health grant allocations aren't normally announced by now. So we just need to check that that does happen. We're still waiting on household support grant announcement. I suspect that's going to be in the spring budget. We've made updates to the model. They are the adjustments that we've made. Feel free to come back to me with any questions that you've got on that. The next full update will be after the budget on the 6th of March. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. So some of what I'll say goes over the same ground as Adrian, but some of that bears repeating, I guess. So as Adrian said, I'm going to look at more distributional issues, just looking at the figures, what that means across the country between final and provisional. If you move on the slide, Adrian, please. So yeah, 604 million additional, as Adrian said, most of that social care grant, 500 million. 50 million RSDG, 72 million funding guarantee, business services grant, and then the additional council tax, which are the 3 authorities that have been permitted additional flexibilities. And we'll come back to that because there are other what isn't included are the figures for Birmingham, who've also now, I think, had a 10% allowance agreed, and I know Somerset applied and have had that denied. Adrian mentioned earlier on that fire and districts might have asked for more flexibility around council tax, quite simple and not particularly large amounts, but that they have also been knocked back. But I think what we'll see is that council tax is such a big thing now. The ability to raise council tax, its biggest element of spending power, and those that are allowed to raise council tax, we'll see a racing ahead in terms of spending power, whether that's justified or not, particularly if others are being told they can't raise it. But it shows the power of council tax within the settlement, and that provides opportunity for some, but I'd suggest it provides a big problem for the next government. So as Adrian said, the overall increase in cost spending powers has gone up by a percentage point. We'll look at how that's spread. But it's still a long way short, isn't it, of the 4 billion which the LGA often uses now as its proxy for budget gap across the whole sector. So it's probably bridged it by a 7th or an 8th maybe. And I won't say much about productivity plans because it will just no doubt anger you all. But it's there, and I wonder if it will be there in a year's time when a new government of whatever colour comes in. Move on one. So that's in a nutshell. I won't spend much time on this because Adrian's been over it. The additional, the second from right column shows where the extra cash is, mainly social care, a little bit of council tax, and then bits and bobs that have been fed into those other areas. And we'll look a little bit more at funding guarantee because, as Adrian said, it's really quirky, it's really strange. And there's a couple of things I still can't get my head around, which hopefully some of you might be able to help with when we get to it. So if we move on another one. So that shows the provisional increase in core spending power from the provisional settlement in December. What we showed when we did that was pretty much the increases were fairly even across all upper tier authorities, with districts lagging behind a little bit. We observed then that outer London boroughs did slightly less well than the other upper tiers, and that is simply because of council tax gearing, because of low tax bases, etc. And again, we'd suggest going forward that will become a problem for whichever government takes over. But generally, pretty even Steven across the piece. And if we move on one, we'll see what's happened with the extra money. And as Adrian showed on that slide that showed every authority, the government of, you might call it skillful, I don't know, but effectively everybody's got something. Say everybody, 3 authorities don't appear to have. Again, that's something to do with funding guarantee, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But pretty much, whether that is the mechanics or whether the ministers have said, look, make sure everybody gets about the same with a few exceptions and make it happen through the MECs that you've got. I suspect that might have been the case. But I think that then is possibly a message that the government has received that actually the whole sector is in turmoil here. Lots potentially could fall over, and therefore don't target any extra money. Just make sure everybody gets a bit of extra money, and let's try not to get any 114s, any further 114s in an election year, maybe. If we move on, Tony. In terms of this, again, was it provisional? This was a regional look. In December, what we were able to show is that pretty much across the regions, there wasn't much of a difference in terms of spending power, although there is a difference in how that spending power is made up. So in the south, increases in council tax make a higher contribution to the increase, and in the north and Yorkshire and Humberside, it tends to be the government funded side of it, mainly social care grants, which have made good the spending power increase, which taken together has pretty much given everybody, or gave everybody, around a 6.5% increase. And if we move on we will see that it's pretty much the same with the extra monies. So everybody now is around a 7.5% increase. You'd count yourself unlucky to be well below that and lucky to be above it. And if I think the next slide shows, this is, I think, where council tax comes back into it, and put this up last time. If there is no additional funding, and there's no signs at the moment that there is additional government funding, then we repair back to a system which is almost entirely reliant on council tax, or reliant on council tax for any increases in spending power. And this just takes the previous slide and just looks at the red bar, which is council tax. And you can see already a distortion there in terms of where the extra spending power money comes from in the southeast particularly, but also in the southwest and east of England. A lot more money comes from council tax gains. Now that tends to be that council tax is a mixture, it's a combination of Band D, isn't it, and of tax base, and therefore those authorities that have either a high Band D and or a high tax base, i.e. they've got more Band E to H houses, they've got housing growth, they've got lower levels of council tax support, are going to race ahead, all things being equal, if the only change in spending power in future years is increases in council tax. Whereas those authorities in the north that are much more reliant on grants, have tax bases that tend to be lower, more Band A's to C's, higher council tax support, will fall behind. And unless an additional money goes in to equalise that, or there is some form of fair funding review fairly soon, council tax will become more and more dominant, and there will be a redistributional effect in favour of high tax base, low needs authorities. So if we move on another slide, that shows a little bit where we're coming from. So this shows spending power since 11-12, organised by the three main funding streams. Council tax, which you can see is just edged up and up and up and up. The social care grants, which latterly have allowed the government to level up because they're throwing a lot more social care grants, needs-based authorities with higher needs. But this year looks like it's the last year of any such increases, all things being equal. And then the red bit, which is everything else, which is squeezed over time, not least because of the massive reductions in RSG, SFA between 11-12 and 15-16. But that tends to be the area that's squeezed, and if it will probably increase with inflation, but in real terms, there doesn't seem to be any prospect of that increasing. So you're left with a system now that is 56% reliant on council tax, and as things stand, that percentage will increase, and that I think will have severe consequences for the redistribution of funding over the next few years without any intervention. So if we move on one, so looking at the change now and how that distributes, and I use this in quite a few of our models. So it's a lovely color-coded thing where the two shades of blue, dark blue is inner and light blue is outer London, unitaries are in yellow, Mets in red, and Shire counties in green. That just shows that the provision settlement, the redistribution, what we said at that time was Wandsworth has done really well because it's got a lot of new EMS bonus, and still the case. And a lot of the outer London boroughs have done much less well. And that's all, again, to do with council tax and council tax bases and base increases. If we move on one, we can see how that's changed over 1 year. So leaving the left-hand side aside for a moment, pretty much everybody has had, you know, around a 1% uplift, haven't they? Not a big difference, a little bit at the end there, but it's not significant. But moving back to the left, again, this shows how the government has obviously said, ensure everybody gets something, but actually we're going to give, as Adrian pointed out, the islands, sorry, ours are silly aren't on here, but we're going to give the islands extra money, so 3 million extra to Isle of Wight, bumps up their spending power over and above the average, and Thurrock and Slough both being allowed to shuffle up their council tax by an extra 5 percentage points to 10%. Makes their means that they're way above average. And then just after that, you can see a very, very slight uptick after those three, where there's a handful of authorities that do slightly better, and it is only slightly better. And that will be the Rural Service Development Grant upper tier authorities that will have got a little bit more from that. They'll have maybe lost some of that to the funding guarantee, but some of them are, you know, places like Herefordshire, North Yorkshire gain quite significantly. Cumbria, the two new Cumbria authorities will gain quite significantly from that. But otherwise, pretty much a flat figure, flat position. If we move on, so looking at now 23-24 final compared to 24-24 final. You see again Slough and Thurrock and Isle of Wight, second, third, and fourth place. Wandsworth still retain their top of the tree status because they had big new EMS bonus. And as I said, the other side, and look at this in a second, a load of outer London boroughs not doing so well. And if we move on to that slide, next slide, Adrian. Sorry, it must be the one after that. Those four, the four that have had the lowest increase in spending power also have really low council tax gearing. Now, in the case of Enfield, Brents and Newham, they've just got really, really low tax bases. So they've got a lot of band A to C's, high levels of council tax support. And therefore, when they put their 5% up, they get nowhere near what much more prosperous areas do. Hillingdon has a higher tax base, but has a low band D, so it is similarly stranded with low council tax gearing. And unless there's some form of resources equalisation or extra money thrown through the needs formula, those authorities and others like them will continue to fall behind. It was only a little bit on this year, but the little bit is masked by the fact that certainly three of those authorities will have had quite generous social care grant increases, which kind of brings them back closer to the average. But when they move out the way, they're just left with tax base and council tax increases, and they will fall way behind with no intervention. So council tax, to my mind, is a really, really big part of the system. And because it's been allowed to become so big, something needs to be done about the size of it and the lack of a redistribution of resources element, resources equalisation element, if we're going to continue having fair allocations going forward. So if we move on another one, Adrian, I just wanted to spend a while on Thurrock, Slough, Woking, Birmingham have been allowed additional council tax flexibility. Districts, Fire, Somerset haven't, which seems a bit inequitable at the moment. But I just want to look a little bit. I've often wondered about, do some work on capital and the capitalisation directions. what effectively Thurrock apparently have 632 million in capitalisation directions. That means they're going to post over the next couple of years 632 million pounds of revenue expenditure through REFCUS. It means it's going to increase their need to borrow, but there's going to be no underlying assets. So their debt gearing will go stratospheric. Now, I've just done back of an envelope calculations, and I know Thurrock have sold a lot of assets, so I know that they're not entirely, but say they did, the capitalisation directions require them to make an MRP over 20 years, so that's 5%, isn't it? Interest, if at the moment you say it's about 5% if you just get a loan out, although I think it'd be 6% because they have to pay a 1% penalty. On that 632, Thurrock would be paying, if they weren't able to sell any assets, they'd be paying £63 million a year just in additional debt financing costs aligned with their capitalisation direction. The additional council tax that they're allowed to muster from the additional 5% is 4 million. So it's not even a 15th of the amount. The capitalisation, and Thurrock is at one extreme, although I suspect Woking's somewhere further beyond that extreme. But the capitalisation directions are, and the problems those authorities have, feel like they're eye-watering. And whilst I think it's probably right that council tax is allowed to start jumping up, although I wouldn't if I was a resident of Thurrock, the difference that and the amount of stress that financial stress that those authorities with directions are under it just feels considerable, and the council tax flexibility is, albeit an important, but is still a really small drop in the ocean towards those authorities. Now, there'll be others, and maybe some on this call, considering capitalisation directions. But again, I think a new government really needs to have a look at how it's going to cope with these, because some of those authorities seem so far beyond a sustainable position that it feels difficult to know how, without some mega reductions in service, they will cope. But it'd be an interesting one to chat about. If we move on, sorry, that was just a bit of a capital aside there, which is always good. So this was the district 1 year change at provisional, and at the time I thought it just doesn't look right. This Watford can't be the only place that has raced ahead on NHB. And I look at the Watford figures, I can see them there, and I can see that they're up 10%. I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand it at the time. Turns out it was an error. So if we move on one to how things are now. So Watford has disappeared back into the pack. The one that's gone up is Woking because of the council tax flexibility. And just look out for these three ones that I've put in red here as we move on to the next slide, because I don't get this at all. I don't know whether you do yet, Adrian. So this is the 1 year change between final and provisional. So there's a few things to say here. Woking shot up. That's not surprising because they're allowed to increase their council tax. Council tax doesn't get picked up. Council tax increases don't get picked up by the funding guarantee, so that's immune from that. And the one that's got the big drop is Watford. Just somebody's got the NHB figures wrong. Government Watford, someone, but that's why that's there. Everybody else, district-wise, pretty much flat. And flat, with the exception of three authorities, which are Gloucester, Great Yarmouth and Melton, which is picked out in red. Just don't know. It must be some interplay with RSDG increases, but Gloucester and Great Yarmouth don't get them, and Newham's bonus changes and the funding guarantee. And I had to check the figures because it just seems strange that three fall out like that and everybody else is the same. But check them back to the core spending power figures, and they are like that. So if you're Melton, Great Yarmouth or Gloucester, I think you can feel slightly badly done too. The other thing to say is lots of districts get rural services delivery grant, but as Adrian said, earlier, that you saw that slight uptick at upper tier. There's no uptick whatsoever if you're a district receiving rural services delivery grant. You lose it all back through the funding guarantee. So as has happened before with funding guarantee, it's no good gaining in something else because you just lose it through funding guarantee. I suppose, though, what's important, I think you said this, Adrian, didn't you, that it's in the base. So 110 million in the base is better than 95, because when they come to rebase things, the 110 will probably stay there. And when funding guarantee finally gets kibosh, which one day hopefully it will, then those gains will still be there because they're in the base. But for now, if you're a district, if you were celebrating the increase in rural service delivery grants, you would have also seen an equal opposite reduction in your funding guarantee, and therefore a neutral impact upon your change. If we move on, and again, so just very quickly, it's a bit of a repeat, but with the new figures, and it sort of takes us into where we might go forward. So if you look at the change in core spending power in this year's final settlement and compare it with 15-16, you can see what I should have said, sorry, this is through a lens of deprivation, with the most deprived upper tier authority on the left there and the least deprived on the right. So you've got Blackpool on the far left, Wokingham on the far right. Since 15-16, it's fair to say that the government has put more spending power into more deprived areas. But and actually, I said this last time, 15, if you look at all the figures, they always have 15-16 as the starting point. Well, that's rather a convenient starting point because it ignores the 4 years before, when Eric Pickles destroyed SFA RSG, which hit those most deprived authorities much more significantly. So if we move on to the next slide, if you add in 11-12, if 11-12 is your base and not 15-16, you see an opposite thing. So whilst Secretary of State since Eric Pickles have done a reasonable job of ensuring spending power goes up in more deprived areas, it still isn't enough to have overcome the massive reductions during council tax freeze era that were enacted during the austerity years between 11-12 and 15-16. So if we move on one, I think that this will show the council tax element, and this is my point about, if this is now the only element that's set to increase without any intervention over the next few years, this is the 1 year increase in council tax per head. It was flattened out by there being lots more social care grant for the most deprived. But once that's gone, if this is the only thing that increases in future years, you can see that slight that those on the right, those least deprived authorities, will see bigger increases in pound terms in spending power. In percentage terms, they'll be even bigger yet. So that, I guess, is the worry. That's the reason we need a fair funding review. That's the reason we need more money thrown, I guess, at local government, because otherwise council tax will prevail, and that will have differential consequences depending on your tax base. If we move on one, I think we move into the districts, and talked about social care grants being the equalising factor, at least in the last year, and the factor that's allowed the government to put more money in less deprived areas at upper tier. No such thing happens at lower tier. There is no needs-based funding that has gone into the system ostensibly since 11-12. So council tax for districts has taken over. So you see a much bigger redistribution in districts, where those areas that have got low tax base tend to be in more deprived areas. Low tax base and low to council tax gearing are still behind their 11-12 levels of spending power, whereas those in lesser deprived areas where taxes, they never got a right lot of grants to lose in the first place, and council tax has taken over and increased, has created a massive redistribution in districts. And again, that trend will continue unless there's some intervention. And at the moment, there's no sign of that other than possibly a whole new government. And moving, I think, to the last slide then, Adrian. So I think the 604 million, the way it was distributed, is acceptance by the government that the whole sector's under stress. It wasn't targeted at anyone particularly. There was a bit of targeting around flexibilities, Woking, Thurrock, Slough, and Birmingham. Birmingham out in the figures. I think they must have agreed Birmingham's 10% afterwards. Will it prevent more Section 114s in an election year? Is that what it was intended to? If it was, I'm not sure it will. I think there might be, some more problems coming down the line. And it's for the next government. This really was the sticking plaster, wasn't it? Even the 600 million, as welcome as it is a bit of a sticking plaster around a system that is broken, in my view. And it's something that the next government will have to pick up, because if they don't, council tax differentials will create redistributions that are, quite unacceptable if you're looking at it through a fair funding or a levelling up lens. And I'll leave you on the favourite part, everybody's favourite part of the settlement, and read bits about it. Just absolutely ludicrous productivity plans, which I'm not convinced will survive beyond the next election. But hey, you never know. And that's that. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant, thanks, Dan. We weren't sure whether we had enough content for an hour, but it turns out we did. That was great. Thanks, Dan. Brilliant. Yeah, there's an awful lot in that final settlement, considering we don't normally do a final settlement webinar. A lot of detail, but a lot of really interesting kind of analysis from Dan there about the way things are distributed now. But I think the point Dan makes at the end there is really important, that 25-26 looks harder in that there's less money around. So there's less opportunity for ministers to move money around the system to offset what might be happening with council tax. And I mean, my view is that there will be some more money for social care. I don't think any future government can get away with not giving more money for social care, and there is some opportunity there for some equalisation, but not equalisation of the full amounts of council tax. So that effective council tax in the system will persist. Well, I think we've probably reached the top of the hour now. So if you can only stay with us for an hour, thanks very much for coming along. If you can stay a bit longer, feel free to put a question in the chat, or just to unmute yourself and make a point or ask a question. Stuart Hogan, if you're around, feel free to come forward and give. What did you think about the settlement?
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Dan. Good presentation. Well done. Okay, some random top of the head thoughts. So there is more money in the final settlement than there was in the provisional settlement, and as Adrian said, this is certainly the largest increase in living memory between the two. Ideally for the Treasury and the department, they want to create a kind of a smooth, calm process between agreeing the amounts of public expenditure that's available in the autumn statement, allocating those in the provisional settlement, concluding on that final settlement, and winning the vote in Parliament. And something went wrong this year, didn't it? And we can trace that right back to the autumn statement, where there was no extra money for public expenditure. The money was allocated to tax reductions, and I think the department must have known it was in trouble in delivering this kind of smooth package, because as far as we can tell, they held back up to £100 million for later decision at final settlement, between where the pressure was coming in the responses, and in fact had to go back to the Treasury and get an additional £500 million for social care. So even the large amount that they held back, at risk of value for money, dare I say, because it's allocated at the last moment, was nowhere near enough. And the way in which it's been approached, as we've heard earlier, shows a final settlement that's dominated by three things for me. The first of all is it's increasingly dominated by the funding guarantee, both in terms of the money that's devoted to that and the allocations that you all see. The second thing it's dominated by is council tax over direct allocations. And the third thing it's dominated by is allocations through out-of-date formulas. And those are the kind of three ghosts that haunt the feast. But we shouldn't lose sight. Actually, I'm going to mention one more thought. The rural funding, which in living memory was about £8.5 million, is the rural grant is now £110 million. Now, it may well be. In fact, we know there are extra costs in running services in rural areas. There are also extra costs in running services in urban areas. But what the rural grant does is there's no kind of scientific basis behind it. It's not tied in any way to the actual extra costs. It's an arbitrary sum which ministers add to each year, depending on the pressure that they feel from rural authorities. So the fact that the money went to social care and it went to rural is evidence of the strength of the representations that were received, rather than some more evidence-based process of allocation. But underneath all this, let's not lose sight of the fact that the thing that changed all this was lobbying by the sector. So well done for that. That was the last time there was significant extra money was in 16-17 for the 4-year settlement, and this is even more. So. Admittedly, there's a backcloth of news coverage and Section 114s, but there's no doubt that the lobbying and the way in which backbench Conservative MPs were leveraged in this process was very important in securing the extra money. What else? Oh, there's a particular quote from me that really struck me, where the Secretary of State said, this is a balanced settlement that reflects our assessment of need, and that's almost Freudian, isn't it? It doesn't reflect a formula assessment of need. It doesn't affect a kind of evidence-based approach. It reflects our assessment of what we need to get the settlement through. In other words, our assessment of needs. And it's absolutely right that there's a strategy of something for everyone here. Which is what leads to the fairly even distribution. The other lens to look at that through is, if any MP stands up in Parliament on any side of the House, there is always something to say to them. Yeah. You got extra money from this pot or that pot. There's always a response that you can make. What else? Productivity plans. Well, this is all about Groundhog Day, isn't it? The last time there was extra money, which was in 16-17, as we said, there was also an idea of productivity plans. My personal view is that in any system, there is always scope for more efficiency and improved transformation of services, public or private. But to do this well in the local authority sector, where it's particularly challenging, where it's a really distributed delivery system with hundreds of players, you need a very strong strategy, national strategy for this, where it's clear what central government's role is, it's clear what the LGA's role is and other national bodies, it's clear what third-party roles are, and it's clear what the roles of individual authorities and groups of authorities are. And this is a really serious matter. I'll leave you to decide whether you think a 2-page plan based on existing intentions meets up to those standards or not. What else? Reform. So again, we've got a statement that there will be engagement with the sector over the coming months, which is surely the weakest possible statement that you could make to give any evidence of progress, isn't it? I think I picked up a little bit of a sense of wanting to do this on a kind of certainly a cross-sectoral basis, maybe a cross-political basis as well. I think if you were cynical, you would say that that's a way of moving towards commanding some kind of majority in Parliament for change, so you're not overly reliant on small groups of backbenchers who feel badly done by the process. And it might also be a way of starting a process that allows you to have continuing influence on it, even if the Conservatives were to lose the election. What else? New homes bonus was mentioned. I mean, I think this is on the cusp. It's essentially a risk assessment if the government does change, or even if it doesn't, about whether you can withdraw it quickly if that's what you want to do, and if you're secure against the challenge of against legal challenge for doing that at short notice. Withdrawing it gives you extra money to play with to solve other problems. Keeping it in place is the Conservative with a small c approach, which is the safer approach to legal challenge.
I suppose the issue, so Stuart, I was going to say the issue, I guess, for 25-26, if there's less money around and council tax is more dominant, there may only the pot of new homes bonus might be the only money that's left to do something with, I guess.
Yes, exactly, and that's the incentive to end the scheme, finally put it out its misery and execute it. Given that it's been dying on its feet for a very long time, and everybody seems to have kind of lost interest and faith in it as a positive incentive for house building. But it's for those. By that time, those houses will have been built. People will have made the effort, produced the housing, be waiting for the incentive payment or the reward payment, if you like. Mm-hmm. So there is a strong sense of grievance that could arise from that, and you have to be careful that you don't do something which is vulnerable to legal challenge.
Yeah.
I think that was my kind of top of the head thoughts.
No, that's great, Stuart. I mean, I think it's interesting your point you made about the lobbying as well being effective.
Yes.
And there was I remember the 2016 lobbying, and as you said, that generated £300 million over 2 years. I remember, probably Dan remembers it better than me, the rural lobbying in 2013, and that only generated like that 8.5 million.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the rural lobby at that point, they won the argument that they needed more funding or they'd been badly dealt with in that settlement, but they didn't get the money to back it up. Whereas this time round, the money's really has flowed, hasn't it?
Yes, and sorry, I lost track of what I was going to say. Oh yes, so this is difficult for the local authority sector, isn't it? There's hundreds of you, and creating a kind of movement for change at very short notice, in a short consultation period, with a national body in the LGA that finds it difficult to take a view on distribution, not quantum, but distribution, is a real challenge for the local authority sector. And we always used to look at the NHS and just think how powerful and effective they were at securing extra resources, and if only local government was as good at that. But this was an impressive performance this year. The point I missed out on productivity plans was that reference that future settlements will be informed by performance against these plans. Well, if you're going to hang the allocation of pound notes on productivity plans, you really need to specify them and consult on the content of those and how they are assessed an awful lot more than just a general 2-page return by local authorities.
Yeah, based on stuff that you've already done.
Exactly.
Here's one I made earlier: productivity plan that's going to be used to distribute funding. It doesn't quite ring true, does it?
Doesn't hang together.
No. They carried on with their 4-day week campaign as well. Their obsession with the 4-day week.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I guess it feels like it's the end of a government, even if we don't know who's going to win the general election. It does feel like it's just staggering on to the end, with 25-26 being in a different world and a different time, with a different spending review, a different government, different set of ministers.
It seems strange that if you were just reading the press, that the predominant local authority manpower staffing issue that's got coverage is the 4-day week.
Yeah,
that just seems
yeah,
odd.
It's
to me.
misguided. Jeff, what were you going to say?
I was just going to pick up, Adrian, when we're saying about 25/6 and comprehensive spending review. Naturally, if there's a October and November general election, there won't be a comprehensive spending review for 25/6. It'll be a 1 year.
Yeah.
And if it is the Labour government, then yeah, there is actually a lot Labour can do without putting extra money in to redistribute.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be a biggie for, I'll call it, more deprived areas. So yeah, new homes bonus, rural service delivery grant, there's pots of cash there that can go, that can be moved. And I know kind of that will impact districts quite heavily, but as Dan knows, I don't really care too much about that. Just the productivity plans, they're talking about blood boiling. Kind of, can DLUC do a productivity plan first before the sorry, Stuart, before they ask us to do one? Local government's lost 25% of its staff in the last 15 years. The civil service has increased by about 100,000 posts. So if those guys can start slashing through themselves, then I'm more than happy to do a productivity plan. And whichever government gets in next, whichever one, I was trying to think what the worst situation might be for going into a council as a new corporate director of finance. And I kind of decided, you've just come through LGR, so you're merging councils together. You've got a new financial management system. You've got a new bunch of councillors. You've just issued a section 114. The government's given you the capitalisation directive the size of that Thurrock one, Dan. And you've got failing social care and failing kind of services within the council. Let's be honest, whoever's in the next government, that's the kind of challenge they've got. To try and come in and square this circle of enormously failing public services because of lack of investment. A rhetoric about we can't increase national taxation anymore. It's incongruous. National taxation is going to have to increase significantly if we want the public services that we expect. And if that doesn't happen, then it's like running around a fire, dipping your hand in every now and then and feeling it's a little bit hot without trying to put the fire out. So I do really, really worry that sticking plasters aren't enough. There's going to have to be, and Labour saying they'll stick with conservative spending plans for 2 years. The first thing Labour should do is reverse that national insurance reduction and put that money into public services. And if the Conservatives come out with more tax cuts in 2 weeks, that will just be the final nail in the coffin for a possible future Labour government, because they will have no wriggle room, nothing at all. And the idea that the Chancellor is spending that £20 billion now on the basis of an OBR forecast of a surplus he might have in 27, 28, if that was a council doing that, we would be absolutely pilloried for that. So I do kind of, it does worry me, but whoever comes in and is the next government, it's like coming in as a finance director into that council with all those things that are wrong.
So Jeff, no need to apologise to me. No longer my responsibility.
Well, it was tongue in cheek, Stuart, as you know.
I think the point you make about Thurrock, though, I mean, that is an extreme. Although, as I said, I think Woking might be, not Wokingham, cracky now. Woking will be at the other end of the extreme, but you only have to read some, particularly around some of the Mets up in the north that are considering capitalisation directions. It's just, it doesn't feel like it adds up even at lower amounts. And I think that's one thing the next government's going to have to really get a handle on. I think the balance sheet health now, but a whole load of councils is really showing up, and all this extra bit of extra money will do is just probably give a few more months, keeping the wolf from the door. But it's some of the capitalised. When you look at Slough, when you look at Croydon's accounts prior to a capitalisation direction, they're just going to be absolutely in pieces in the next couple of years, and I suspect their residents will be paying for certainly 20 years, and even then I'm not sure that will be enough.
But I think what's interesting for me, Dan, is that graph that you showed of the impact of since 2011-12. I think most of us who've been here long enough recognise that. However, that is just funding. That doesn't pick up increase in demand for services. Because if you showed the same thing based upon deprivation, you'd see exactly the same thing. And the big issues for us all right now, the government went on for years, didn't they, about adult social care. That isn't where the pressure is. The adult social care pressure is derived from national living wage. So it's linked to government policy. The big pressures for most councils up a tier, and in some circumstances district councils, it's around homelessness and it's children's services. So the increase in demand in those areas for more deprived areas is phenomenal. So if you linked core spending power and demand increase, then you would get a doubling up of that impact. And that's what often is that the old fair funding review, you always hope might pick that up. But do we really think
that an unfrozen formula would go somewhere? The 4-block model wasn't perfect by any means back in before it was frozen 11-12, but it did pick up trends in things like deprivation, some things like claimant counts, and they would have been fed through, as well as the resources equalisation. So they would have fed through the system, but the effective freezing of that for so long has meant that side, those demand pressures, aren't picked up in the stats either. So I agree with you. It shows the one side. It's a real.
I think the problem with them freezing the formula as well, Dan, and doing a fair funding review is that, well, inevitably there will be losers. And now you may say, well, they're the authorities that have done better from core spending power since 2010. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But even those authorities that would lose, they're not authorities that you look at now and think, well, they're doing fine. There are authorities that already are saying, well, actually, we're in trouble, and we've only got a couple of years before, we're issuing Section 114 reports. So there's no easy wins there. There's no easy authority that you can look at and say, well, yeah, if we reduce their funding by 5%, they'd be fine. I don't really see anyone in that position. So for a future government, any changes they want to make, they're not risk-free.
I think it was always the case, Adrian, that when fair funding came in, kind of Stuart and I probably discussed this years and years ago, when it comes in, the government's got to put more money in. It's the only way it works. And the old adage in the past that fair funding would come in and nobody would lose cash, but that was always going to be criminal, absolutely criminal. But you could see a circumstance where you probably need to put £3 billion in the top of the machine to make a fair funding process work. And it might well be if you put £3 billion in, some authorities might not get any more money, or they might lose, and then you would transition over a 3 to 5 year time frame. In the end, that would be a fair process. But if no extra money goes in the top of the machine, it's no different. It's not going to help.
No.
Because else damping, if you'd have to introduce damping, and damping would be so. If you reran the formula, there'd be massive redistributional things, and damping would dampen most of that away, wouldn't it?
Well, but in that circumstance, kind of, Dan, you damp that. Let's not get me talking about Surrey County Council and how much they've been getting for the last 15 years. They shouldn't have been getting 60 million where it started. I mean, that is beyond criminal. As you can tell, I was contributing to that, and I noticed Claire's on the call. Newcastle were a beneficiary, Claire, but that's fine. So it for me, this is less of an issue about what is the impact and what is fair. So in reality, the financial model needs to be in a place where in 3 to 5 years' time, there is no damping, there's nothing. It is a fair settlement. But to make it work, it needs more money.
I agree with that. Obviously, it needs more money up the top, but it also needs significant funding of time-limited damping. What was done the last time was that there was 1 year of damping that was then frozen. That's what Jeff refers to. We always intended it's set out in the consultation paper in December 2018, which is now more than 5 years old and still hasn't been responded to. That's a whole parliamentary term. Was the idea there was time limited damping? It would unwind over perhaps 3 or 5 years.
And Stuart, when the austerity year first hit 2011-12, there was no damping. So as an example, as an authority, we had to save £66 million in the first year, 2011-12. So when we then say there should be this long-term damping to protect councils who've been receiving far too much money than they should have been doing, it kind of hurts me a little bit to think, well, just let it happen in the first year. But I still understand 3 years to 5 years would seem reasonable. It probably should be a parliamentary term. But fair funding review, if it does come in, will probably be in the second year of a 5-year parliamentary term anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's probably 3 to 4 years, if ever. I still don't see it happening, Adrian, if the truth be known. But if it did, that's the only way it can happen.
No, I know what you mean. We've been saying it's going to happen for so long and it hasn't happened. It's always been the year after next it's going to happen. That I know what you mean. It does feel like it's so hard to do that it won't happen. I mean, there are some things that are easier to do than other things. You know, a baseline reset, for instance, on business rates. In theory, it's pretty easy to do. You know, you could argue it's incentive money. It's short term. It's not long term funding, but you know, some of those amounts now are huge for some councils, and the movement from that will be huge as well. But I'm sure the Treasury is saying to DLUC, there's £1.5 billion worth of retained growth, you know, in local authorities, not necessarily in the places we wanted to be in. Could we not use some of that? Why haven't you reset the baselines already? So I guess there will be pressure to do stuff, but I wouldn't fancy being in DLUC and having to put some of those things through. I'll be honest.
If I had a choice, Adrian, I'd get rid of business rate retention as well. You know,
I like it. I like it. I think it's great. At least we've got two taxation streams that we kind of like keep hold of all of it or most of it.
Well, I think what you'll probably find is that some councils can keep it. It's a methodology of, you know, we don't need to be incentivized. Say new homes bonus, we're not incentivized to build houses. It's called council tax base increase. Yeah. So you get a double incentive. You don't need it. We don't need incentive to grow our businesses locally. We don't need that. It simply rewards more affluent areas. It's that great council Dan keeps reminding us of, who's got a massive warehouse system next to the A1. You know, that extra funding is absolutely shocking. That's not the way local government should work. We're not a business. We provide public services. So yeah, business rate retention needs to go, and it just needs to come through grant predicated upon the fair funding formula. And finally get rid of that car parking issue in Westminster and build that into the build that into the formula and make them double the council tax, Stuart. I think it's all that one, and that'll sort one of the last vagaries out.
I'm not sure if Westminster are on the call, but we do have that. Actually, I know someone from K&C is on the call, but we do have that as a relic of one of the previous consultation papers. That's still an option in our fair funding model, that you can look at the impact of including car parking income within the equalisation. Yeah, it does move money around. It does move. And I see Nikki from Trafford said that, you know, in some cases the retained growth is the only thing that's keeping some authorities, you know, out of Section 114. And you know, in Greater Manchester, they've got a 10-year deal now, Jeff. So they've got 10 years more of a business rate pilot.
But it's back to the process of, if you got rid of all that and you had a fair funding model and you put more money in, yeah, then authorities who are presently seeing themselves in trouble see that they end up with more funding. Some councils end up with less funding and then say that they would have to reduce their services, but they're only reducing their services to the place all those other councils are already at.
Yeah.
So, if you know, kind of,
if you did the car parking, if you did the car parking thing, watch the RO forms within a year. Watch the car parking can disappear into some other line, never to be seen again.
Yeah, what we need is a kind of an organisation like kind of Pixel Dan, who then would go in and kind of clarify the reality of it all.
Yeah, car parking. That's a lot. There's a lot of money in that, but it's not. It's a small number of authorities, but where you've got it's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's why certain authorities have such a low council tax. Again, it's unfair, absolutely unfair, and local government funding should be fair.
Yeah,
that's all anybody can hope for.
Just thinking about lobbying in the future, you know, I mean, there has been a very successful lobbying operation in the last month or so. County Councils Network and also, you know, Rural Services Network, those two groups of authorities effectively mobilising MPs and you know, helping. Yeah, that's kind of the leverage that's been applied. But the next settlement, if we assume it's going to be a Labour government, where's that lobbying operation going to come from? Do you think there's on Sagoma and other groups they've got as an effective operation, or do you think that they'll need to step up quite a bit?
I think Sagoma are already lobbying quite heavily.
Yeah.
So there's one of the problems I've found this lately, and again it gets down back to council tax, is if you look at Sagoma, for instance, but the same, and CCN's probably only ones that isn't. RSN's the same. There's such a difference now. You know, Solihull is 1 million miles from Knowsley. They're totally different, but they're both Sagoma authorities. They're both metropolitan authorities. Solihull, reasonably high tax base, and because council tax is so big, I think some of those representative groups now have quite a few disparities within them. County council network, funnily enough, it tends to represent high tax base, mainly rural shire authorities, and it's probably easy for them to lobby. I mean, they are pretty effective at it.
CCN's got Durham and Surrey in the same grouping.
Well, we're all friends, Adrian. Yeah. We're all good friends.
Yeah.
But it very much depends with political parties in nationally about how you can actually lobby.
Yeah.
Those extremes. What the rural services, you said earlier on, Stuart, it was 8.5 million, and that was really good at the time. But there's a cut-off point. The last one to get it and the first one not to get it were very similar. And at 8.5 million, the last one to get it got a few quid, and the one that didn't get it didn't get anything. But now that's been because they've just multiplied. It's now 11 times bigger. That means that the ones that missed out have missed out massively because the others have raced ahead. And that gets back to the lack of science that was involved in putting it, and the fact that the lobby is just get the money out, isn't it? So I think lobbying becomes more complex in bigger groups because everybody's so different, and the things have changed so much that it becomes harder to congregate around a single issue with everybody in your lobby group.
There's some simple ones, Dan, such as closing the loophole in housing benefit, where we can't recover all of the housing benefit when we're paying temporary accommodation and supported housing. I mean, that is absolutely criminal, that loophole. So as an example, for us, it's costing us £3 million a year. Now, if that loophole's closed, all it means is that DWP end up paying more housing benefit to councils. So it's an impact in government, but it brings extra money into local government. So there's no authority who could have a problem, I don't think, with pushing on that one. And that would be a massive fillip for us. And it's actually, back to my usual word, it's unfair that some councils, so, you know, across municipal authorities at the moment, this is on homelessness. It's a massive growing issue. And that hole within the housing benefit system is pretty wrong. So there's some things you can coalesce around as local government, but there's other areas where it's quite difficult, because even within Sagoma, you know, if you jump up and down about certain things, there's winners and losers.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, and London's even more, you know, varied between, you know, central London boroughs and some of those outer London boroughs that Dan was spotting there. You know, each kind of geographical grouping or class grouping has got a wide range of different types of authority. You know, when you look even in the Met authorities, places that you think of as being very deprived don't necessarily gain from a fair funding review because they're getting so much from social care grants and that kind of thing, where they don't necessarily gain from a new formula in social care. So the longer this goes on, the more perverse some of the outcomes might be when you make changes. It becomes harder and harder to really foresee what's going to happen and what the impacts will be.
Which is why the only recovery in the end is more money.
That's absolutely right. And the other factor is that because there are so many different moving parts to a reform package, you can only really defend it if you do everything, which is all the more difficult to secure. So if you just introduce new formulas, then people will say, well, why didn't you do more on resources equalisation? And you know, it's and the reset, you know, that it's a different set of authorities gaining and losing. So you end up biting off something that's very, very large and very difficult to pull off. But it's unfair in a sense, to use Jeff's word, to do parts of the picture, because other authorities are advantaged and disadvantaged by doing it only partially.
I guess a good example there, Stuart, there's two different things. One, the fact the Conservative government keep jumping up the rural service delivery grant is doing just that. It's targeting into one area, which, bear in mind, we're very rural and don't get any of that funding, which is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But that is targeting in a certain way, but the current formula picks up rurality anyway. So the current formula is supposed to pick that up. But in the future, children's social care, the number of children in care in the base model now compared to where it's actually at, the redistribution of that from London to outside of London is enormous if that was introduced. So that could be done and massively redistribute funding. At the same time, if I'm in London, I'm saying, can you use the updated population figures, please?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
as you said, kind of
Exactly.
a possible Labour government could easily, as the Conservatives have with our RSG or RFDG, could say, yeah, we're just going to do the children's one.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it can redistribute funding significantly. But as local government, we've got to be very careful that if we turn in and fight against each other, then you can be divided. The first thing is, through the LGA, local government have to push for more money. Once we've got more money, we can have the argument about who gets what.
Yeah. My suggestion as well, Jeff, is we should start off by devising the transition system and then work back from there. See, that's the first thing you work out, because then that defines the parameters for how fast people can lose or gain, and then you can make changes within that. I should also put my role hat on, Jeff, and say that the RSDG started at the time because there were changes in sparsity within the formula that were then damped away. So rural authorities didn't get those changes they should have got in the formula back in 13-14, and then that's where the grant came in. There are all sorts of anomalies, as you say, around who does and doesn't get it, but that was certainly the way that it was approached. And I say that because I think Kerry from RSN's on the call, or maybe Dan was. So just making sure I'm making your case as well. I think that's probably it. We've kind of overrun a little bit, but thanks very much for coming along today. Thanks for contributing and giving us your time. Hope that's been useful. It's certainly been a good lively conversation at the end. I've enjoyed that a lot, and we'll see you again soon. I think the next thing we'll do will probably be after the spring budget, the beginning of March. So good to see you all and catch you all soon. Cheers. Thank you. Bye bye.